Nola Winslow didn't know that the man carrying a single trunk into the cottage next door was the most powerful wolf in 12 territories. She knew only three things. It was a Tuesday, the bees were restless, and Dorinda Vetch was already watching from her garden wall. "Well," Dorinda said, loud enough to carry. "At least someone's finally moving into that wreck. Maybe he'll fix the roof before winter." Nola didn't respond. She knelt in the clover beside her third hive, smoke curling from the tin can in her hand, and kept her eyes on the comb. The bees hummed their low, familiar chorus. Their sound was the one constant in a life that had gone very, very quiet. The cottage next door had been empty for 2 years. The last tenant had been an elderly weaver who died peacefully in her sleep, and no one in the village of Thornhollow had bothered to claim it. Too small, too close to the orchards, too far from the main road, too close to Nola. She'd heard that part whispered too. "Odd girl," they said, "keeps bees and talks to no one." And then, the one that stuck like a burr in her ribs every time. "She'll never find a mate. Not with that temperament." Dorinda had been the first to say it. Dorinda, with her wide smile and her wider mouth, who could turn a passing comment into village gospel before the bread cooled. And she'd been saying it for 3 years now, ever since Nola had turned down the butcher's son and then the tanner's nephew, and then simply stopped being asked at all. The trunk thumped down on the stone step next door. Nola glanced over without meaning to. He was tall. That was the first thing. Impractically tall for that low doorway, and he ducked beneath the lintel with the ease of someone used to spaces not built for him. Soot-brown hair fell forward across his forehead in a way that looked like it had never once been combed into obedience. His sleeves were pushed to his elbows. His boots were scuffed at the toes. He turned, as though he felt her looking, and his eyes met hers across the low stone wall that separated their gardens. Dark cobalt. Not blue, not gray. The deep, dense color of a sky just before the last light leaves it. Something shifted in Nola's chest. A warmth that had no source, like sitting too close to a fire that wasn't there. The air between them carried the faintest trace of wood smoke, which made no sense at all because neither chimney was lit. "Hello," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, and it settled into her like a stone dropped into still water. "Hello," she said back, and then looked down at her bees because she didn't know what else to do with the strange, sudden heat behind her ribs. His name was Henry. He told her that the next morning, when she found him standing at the wall between their gardens staring at her hive boxes with open curiosity. "I've never seen them this close," he said, as though they were already in the middle of a conversation. "Do they know you?" Nola set down her basket of dried lavender. "They tolerate me. That's not the same thing." He smiled. It was small and private, the kind of smile that suggested he understood the distinction intimately. "I'm Henry," he said. "Henry Wentworth." "Nola." She didn't offer her surname. In Thornhollow, everyone already knew it. And what they thought it meant. "The beekeeper," he said, not as a question. He said it the way someone might say the painter or the healer, as though it were a title worth respecting. The warmth came again. That sourceless, illogical heat, accompanied this time by the ghost scent of wood smoke. The candle in the window behind her, the one she'd left burning from last night, flared brighter for a moment and then settled. Nola frowned at it. "Are you settling in all right?" she asked, because the silence was growing strange and her pulse was doing something she didn't appreciate. "Slowly," he said. He leaned his forearms on the wall, and the motion was so casual, so unguarded, that it startled her. Men in Thornhollow didn't linger at her wall. They crossed the street to avoid it. "The chimney draws badly, the door sticks, the roof leaks in the back corner." "That sounds about right. But the orchard behind the garden is beautiful," he said, "and it's quiet." He said, quiet, like other people said safe. Like it was something he'd been looking for and had almost stopped expecting to find. Nola studied him for a moment, the shadows under his eyes, The careful way he held himself, the tension in his jaw that didn't match the ease of his posture. He looked like someone who had been performing for a long time and had only just stepped off the stage. "It is quiet here," she agreed. "Sometimes too quiet." "No such thing," he said, and meant it. By the third day, the pattern had established itself without either of them deciding it. Nola would come out to tend the hives in the early morning, and Henry would already be in his garden, doing something inefficient with a spade, or staring at the apple trees as though he'd never seen fruit grow before. He moved through the mornings the way water moves into a dry riverbed, slowly, gratefully, filling every quiet corner. She noticed things about him that she shouldn't have been noticing. The way he tilted his head when he listened, like he was hearing something beyond the words. The way he held tools, confidently but incorrectly, as though he was accustomed to holding things that carried weight and consequence, just not garden spades. The deliberate way he slowed himself down, like a man who'd spent years moving at a pace set by someone else and was only now learning how to stop. "You've never gardened," she observed on the third morning, watching him try to turn the soil in a bed that was mostly rock. "That obvious? You're digging in the drainage gravel." He stopped, looked down. His expression was so genuinely chagrined that she laughed before she could stop it. A bright, startled sound that she immediately tried to swallow. He looked up at her, and the warmth behind his eyes made her stomach flip. "Show me," he asked. She shouldn't have. She knew that. The village talked enough about her without adding inviting strange men into her garden to the list. But there was something in the way he asked. Not commanding, not assuming. Just open, the way a cupped palm is open. She came around the wall and knelt beside him and showed him where the soil was workable, and where it wasn't, and which corner got the most sun, and how to tell if the drainage was right by the way the clover grew. She showed him how to test the earth between his fingers. Crumbling meant too dry, sticking meant too wet, and the soft give of good loam meant the ground was ready. He listened the way no one in Thornhollow ever listened to her, with his whole body angled toward her, eyes steady, questions careful and specific. He asked about the root depth of beans, about whether the apple trees needed pruning, about why the clover grew in patches instead of even blankets. Each question was thoughtful, unhurried, as though her answers were something he intended to keep. No one had ever treated her knowledge as something worth keeping. Their hands brushed once, reaching for the same trowel. The touch lasted less than a second. The candle in her kitchen window, a full 30 paces away, flared so high the flame licked the curtain, and Nola lurched to her feet. Did you see that?" Henry was very still. His hand, the one that had touched hers, was resting on his thigh, and he was looking at it as though it had done something without his permission. "I saw it," he said quietly. The air between them smelled of wood smoke and honey. "Who is he then?" Dorinda asked on the fourth day, catching Nola at the village well. Her smile was the one she used when she was collecting information rather than sharing it. "Your new neighbor. His name is Henry. He's renting the cottage." "From where?" "I didn't ask." Dorinda's eyebrows climbed. "You didn't ask. You, who notices every bee in a swarm of 10,000, didn't think to ask where a grown man came from before letting him into your garden?" Heat crept up Nola's neck. "He was digging in the gravel bed. I showed him where the soil was. That's all." Dorinda filled her pail. "Well, just don't get your hopes up, sweet. I'm sure he's perfectly nice, but men like that don't settle in places like Thornhollow for the company." She paused. "Especially not your company." She said it the way she always said it, wrapped in concern, lined with something sharper. As though she were doing Nola a kindness by keeping her expectations firmly on the ground. Nola picked up her own pail and walked home without answering. When she passed Henry's cottage, she heard him inside. The sound of something heavy being moved. A muttered word. The scrape of wood on stone. Through the half-open window, she saw the fireplace. It wasn't lit. There was no kindling in the grate. No logs stacked beside it. But the stones of the hearth were warm, She could see the heat shimmer rising from them, the way air bends over sun-baked rock in summer. She kept walking. On the 5th day, he brought her bread. It was terrible bread, dense and flat and slightly burned on one side, and he presented it over the garden wall with an expression so earnest that she had to press her lips together to keep from smiling. "I made it," he said unnecessarily. "I can see that. The oven in that cottage hasn't been used in 2 years. I think something may be living in the flue." She turned the loaf over in her hands. It was lopsided, scorched along one edge, and weighed approximately as much as a river stone. But it was warm, and the warmth wasn't just from the oven. She could feel it pulsing through the crust, spreading through her fingers. A steady, living heat that had nothing to do with baking. "You could have bought bread from the baker," she said. "I could have." He rested his forearms on the wall, and the morning light caught the angle of his jaw, the faint line of concentration between his brows. "But then, I wouldn't have had a reason to be standing here." Her heart did something complicated. She held the bread tighter. Nola took the bread. Their fingers touched again, and this time the warmth didn't fade when they pulled apart. It stayed, a low, steady glow in her palms, like holding a mug of tea that never cooled. Behind her, every candle in her cottage lit at once. They both turned to look. 7 candles, the kitchen, the bedroom, the 2 on the mantel, the 3 on the shelf. All burning with clean, steady flames that hadn't been there a moment before. Henry exhaled slowly. "Nola." The way he said her name did something to the architecture of her chest. Like a door she'd bricked shut years ago had just been pushed open from the other side. "This keeps happening," she said, "because someone had to acknowledge it." "I know. The fires, the warmth, the—" She stopped, because the word forming in her mind was one she'd given up on, and saying it out loud felt like pressing on a bruise. "Bond," he said for her. Quietly, like it was something precious he didn't want to drop. She looked at him, really looked, past the rumpled hair and the scuffed boots and the careful ordinariness he wore like a costume, at the breadth of his shoulders, at the way the air seemed to organize itself around him, the way even the trees leaned slightly toward his side of the wall, at the authority in his stillness that had nothing to do with volume. "Who are you?" she whispered. He held her gaze. "I'll tell you. Everything. But I'd like—" He paused, jaw tightening. "I'd like you to know me a little longer as just the man who can't garden and makes terrible bread. If that's all right." It shouldn't have been all right. It was the kind of thing that should have sent her inside with the door locked. But the bond hummed between them. Warm, steady, patient. And the candles burned without wavering, and he looked at her like she was the first real thing he'd seen in years. "One more day," she said. On the 6th morning, it rained, and Nola found Henry sitting on his front step under the narrow overhang, watching the water pool in the lane. She brought him tea, chamomile and honey, from her own bees. She sat on her step across the narrow path, and they drank in silence while the rain came down. The path between their doors was barely 4 paces wide, and the rain turned it into a shallow stream that ran between them like a boundary neither had crossed. Until now, their conversations had stayed in the gardens. Safe territory, plants and soil and bees and bread. The wall between the cottages had been convenient. It let them be close without being intimate. It let the bond build slowly, a banked fire rather than a blaze. But rain changes things. Rain makes the world smaller, draws the walls in, turns 2 people on separate steps into the only 2 people in existence. "I had a life before this," he said eventually, staring into his cup. His voice was different in the rain, lower, stripped of the careful lightness he wore like another layer of clothing. "A life that was very loud. A lot of people needing a lot of things, and I gave them all of it until there wasn't much left." Nola wrapped her hands around her own cup. The rain made a curtain between them, close and private. "I know what that's like," she said. "Except mine went the other way. I had a life where nobody needed anything from me at all, And after a while, I started to believe that meant I had nothing to give. He looked at her through the rain, and his eyes were dark and raw. That's not true. I know that now. Sometimes. Other times, Dorinda Vetch tells the entire village I'll die alone, and I believe that instead. Something shifted in Henry's expression. Not anger, exactly. Something older and colder, like a mountain deciding to notice an insect. His hand tightened on his cup, knuckles whitening, and for a fraction of a second she saw it. The authority, the weight, the sheer immovable force of whatever he was beneath the scuffed boots and the garden dirt. It was there, and then it was gone, folded carefully away. She said that. She says it regularly. It's practically her hobby. He set down his cup. Nola, you are... He stopped. Started again. The way you move through the world, carefully, gently, like everything deserves your attention. That isn't a flaw. I've known powerful people my entire life, people who could command armies, and not one of them has the strength it takes to be soft in a place that tells you softness is weakness. Her throat closed. She looked down at her tea and blinked hard, because no one had ever, not once, not ever, spoken to her like that. You don't know me, she managed. I know that your bees are healthy and your garden is thriving, and you brought tea to a stranger in the rain without being asked. That tells me enough. The rain fell. The bond between them was so warm now that steam should have risen from their skin. Inside her cottage, every candle burned high and steady, and through his half-open door she could see the cold hearth glowing with a gentle heat that had no flame. She took a breath. Tell me who you are. Please. He stood and crossed the narrow path to her step. The rain soaked through his shirt in seconds, but he didn't seem to notice. He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and where they touched, the warmth bloomed so fiercely that the rain seemed to evaporate before it reached them. My name is Henry Wentworth, he said. I am the Alpha King of the Western Territories. I've held that title for 11 years, and I came here because I was drowning in it, and I needed... His voice roughened. I needed to remember what it felt like to be a person. Just a person. And then I moved into a broken cottage next to a woman who talks to bees, and I haven't needed to be anyone else since. Nola sat very still. The rain ran down her back, and she didn't feel it. The Alpha King. The man who held the 7 Western packs together, who brokered the territorial accords, whose name was spoken in council halls she would never enter. The man whose decisions shaped the lives of thousands. That man. This man, with bread flour still dusted on his collar and rain dripping from his hair, and a garden full of waterlogged beans. She waited for fear to come, for the distance to open up between them, the gap that rank and power always carved. She waited to feel small. It didn't come. He was still Henry. He was still the man who'd said hello across a wall. You made me terrible bread, she said faintly. I did. The Alpha King made me terrible bread. In my defense, the flue really does need cleaning. She looked at him. He was waiting. Braced, she realized, for her to pull away. For the wall to go up. For the knowledge of who he was to become a barrier that hadn't been there before. She thought of Dorinda's voice. She'll never find a mate. Not with that temperament. She thought of every time she'd believed it. Every night she'd blown out her single candle and told herself that alone was just another word for peaceful. And then she thought of how he'd said, hello, across a garden wall, like it was the simplest thing in the world. The bread really was terrible, she said. His laugh was short and raw and slightly broken, and she felt it reverberate through the bond like a bell struck in a cathedral. The warmth between them surged, and every candle in both cottages flared at once, and the cold hearth in his empty kitchen bloomed into flame without a single log to feed it. Nola, he said, and his hand found hers, and where their palms met, the warmth was so absolute that the rain seemed to bend around them, a curtain of water that couldn't quite reach. I don't care about the title, she said, and her voice only shook a little. I care that you sat in a broken garden and let me teach you where the good soil was. I care that you brought me bread you knew was awful because you wanted a reason to stand at my wall. I care that you say my name like it matters. It does matter. His hand tightened on hers. You matter. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know it, if you'll let me. She turned toward him on the step, and the rain came down around them like something holy, and she lifted her face to his. He cupped her jaw with his free hand, gently, so gently, as though she were something irreplaceable, and kissed her. It was slow, deliberate, a question and an answer in the same breath. His mouth was warm, and the rain was cold, and the bond between them caught fire. Not burning, not consuming, but the deep, steady warmth of a hearth that had been waiting years for someone to come home to it. When he pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, every fire in Thornhollow, every hearth, every candle, every lantern in every window on the village green, burned brighter, just for a moment, just long enough for the whole village to look up and wonder. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, slow and reverent, as though memorizing the shape of her by touch. His breathing was unsteady. Hers was worse. I've been wanting to do that since you told me I was digging in gravel, he said, and his voice was rough at the edges, fraying where the control usually held. She laughed, a wet, startled, slightly overwhelmed laugh, and his arms came around her and she let herself be held in the rain on the step of a cottage in a village where everyone had decided she wasn't worth wanting. They sat there until the rain stopped. Neither of them moved first. Neither of them wanted to. The bond hummed between them like a living thing, hearth-warm, steady, ancient. And Nola thought, so this is what it feels like. Not fireworks, not a storm. A fire lit in a room that's been cold for years. I should warn you, Nola whispered. Dorinda is going to talk about this for decades. He smiled against her mouth. Let her. The truth came out on a Sunday. Not dramatically. There was no herald, no procession, no announcement from the village green. Henry's second, a tall, quiet man named Joran, who arrived on horseback looking deeply relieved, simply appeared at the cottage door, and by the time he'd left, the word had traveled from the baker to the miller to the chandler's wife, and finally, inevitably, to Dorinda Vetch, the Alpha King, living in the wreck cottage next to the beekeeper, courting the beekeeper. Nola was in her garden when she heard the gate click. So, Dorinda's voice was bright and careful, the way it always got when reality had outpaced her narrative. I hear your neighbor is someone rather important. Nola continued checking the frame she'd pulled from the second hive. The comb was heavy with late-season honey, golden and fragrant, and the bees moved around her hands with patient familiarity. He is, Nola said. Well, I always said you had a certain quality. Didn't I say that? I've always said Nola Winslow has something about her. Nola set the frame back into the hive and straightened. She looked at Dorinda, really looked, the way she'd taught herself not to, because looking meant caring, and caring meant the words could land. What you said, Nola told her quietly, was that I'd never find a mate. You said it to the baker and the miller and the chandler's wife. You said it at the well where you knew I could hear. You said it so often that I believed you, Dorinda. And I spent 3 years thinking there was something fundamentally wrong with me. Dorinda's mouth opened, closed. There isn't, Nola said. And I think you knew that. I think that's why you said it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. 3 years of silence had given the words a weight that shouting never could. She turned back to her bees. After a long moment, she heard the gate click shut. Her hands were shaking, but the bees hummed around her, steady and warm. And from the cottage next door, she heard Henry's footstep on the path, not coming to rescue her, not inserting himself into a fight that was hers to finish. Just there, close enough that the bond pulsed with heat, and the afternoon sun on her shoulders felt like an arm draped across them. "All right?" he asked from the wall. She blew out a breath. "I've wanted to say that for 3 years. It was worth the wait." She looked at him. He was leaning on the wall again, arms folded, hair falling in his eyes, looking nothing at all like a king, and everything like the man who'd said hello to her on a Tuesday and changed the whole shape of her world. "Come for dinner?" she asked. "I'm making soup. It'll be better than anything you could manage." "That's an extremely low bar." "I know. That's why I'm setting it there." He laughed, and the bond hummed between them like a hearth fire in the dead of winter, warm, steady, unshakable. And Nola Winslow, the beekeeper of Thornhollow who'd been told she'd never find a mate, stood in her garden surrounded by bees and honey and the scent of wood smoke that came from nowhere, and smiled. 2 months later. The cottage wall was gone, not demolished, reworked. Henry had hired a mason from the next village, and what had been 2 cramped gardens separated by stacked stone was now a single sprawling space. The hive boxes along the south-facing edge where the clover grew thickest, the vegetable beds, actual soil this time, not drainage gravel, running in neat rows along the north. Nola stood at the kitchen window of what was now their cottage. His knocked through into hers. The 2 small homes opened up into one warm, sprawling, imperfect whole, and watched the morning light move across the garden. Henry was outside, barefoot in the grass, doing something with the runner beans that she would probably need to correct later. He'd gotten better at gardening over 2 months. Not good exactly, but enthusiastic, which mattered more. His hands were dirty, his hair was a mess. The warm gray shirt he wore was the same one he'd been wearing the morning he'd first leaned on the wall and asked about her bees. She loved him so fiercely it was almost a physical location, a specific point in her chest where the bond lived, warm and constant, like a coal that never went out. The hearth behind her burned with a quiet, steady flame, though she hadn't lit it. It had been doing that for weeks, igniting on its own when they were close, as though the bond had decided their home should always be warm. The candles, too. Every evening, as the light faded, the candles in every room flickered to life one by one, a slow constellation that tracked the shape of their evening. Kitchen first, then the sitting room, then the bedroom last. Joran came once a week from the capital with papers and reports. Henry handled them at the kitchen table while Nola extracted honey or repaired frames beside him. The governance of 7 territories, it turned out, could be managed from a cottage in Thornhollow. Not perfectly, not without the occasional journey or official visit, but enough. Enough for him to be both king and the man who couldn't grow beans. There had been questions, of course. Joran had raised his eyebrows approximately to his hairline when Henry had explained that he would not be returning to the capital full-time. The council had sent 3 separate letters, each more politely bewildered than the last. A delegation had arrived once, 4 advisors in formal traveling cloaks, and had found the Alpha King ankle-deep in garden mud helping Nola relocate a hive box that the bees had outgrown. The advisors had gone home. The letters had stopped. She carried 2 cups of tea outside and handed him one. "You're drowning the roots again," she said. He looked at the watering can in his hand, then at the beans, then at her. They looked thirsty. They're waterlogged. I maintain that's a matter of perspective. She sat on the stone bench beside the lavender. Her grandmother's bench, the one piece of this garden she hadn't changed, and curled her hands around her cup. The copper bee pendant at her throat caught the morning light. Henry sat beside her, not close enough to touch, but close enough that the air between them warmed, and the scent of wood smoke rose between them even out here in the open air, and the bees, her bees, the ones who merely tolerated her, drifted past them both without concern. "Dorinda has been telling people she introduced us," Nola said. Henry nearly choked on his tea. "Apparently, she always saw potential in me, a certain quality, she says." "Of course she did," She's bringing us a pie this afternoon. I think it's an apology pie, but she'll never call it that." He set down his cup and looked at her. That steady, unhurried look that she'd come to understand was his way of saying everything words couldn't hold. His hand found hers on the bench, and the touch sent warmth flooding through them both. And in the cottage behind them, the morning fire flared gently higher. "You know," he said, "I came to Thornhollow because I was looking for quiet. And instead you got bees. I got you." He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, and the bond between them hummed its low, constant song, fire and warmth and wood smoke and home. The bees were a bonus. "You still can't garden?" "I'm improving." "Henry, you watered the beans 4 times this morning." "Dedication, that's what that is." She tilted her face up toward him, and he kissed her forehead. Slow, unhurried. The kind of kiss that had nowhere else to be. And the copper bee pendant at her throat warmed against her skin, and the bond settled around them both like sunlight through glass. Nola leaned into his shoulder. The sun climbed above the orchard, and the clover buzzed with wings, and somewhere in the village, Dorinda Vetch was telling anyone who'd listen that she'd always known, always said that girl had something about her. And in the garden where the wall had been, the beekeeper and the king sat together in the morning light and drank their tea, and the fire burned without being asked, and the world was warm.